Dr. Will Tullett. I'm a senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of York, and I'm going to be chairing this fantastic talk today. So thank you for joining us, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. Before I introduce you to our esteemed speaker, I just need to run through a few technical notes. So subtitles are available for the event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching this event live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, which will be available throughout the event. So you can post them anytime, and we'll come back to them at the end and hopefully go through some of those questions for our speaker. And also, please remember that today's event is being recorded, so you can watch it again later and relive the experience if you so wish. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Eleanor Barnett, who is a historian who currently holds a Leverhulme Research Fellowship at Cardiff University. And her work uses food as a lens through which to access the daily lives of ordinary people, as well as the kind of wider cultural and economic, political, religious, historical processes to which historians devote their attention. So you might have seen about already, she posts daily food history stories and paintings and objects from across the world to audiences via Instagram, and also, very excitingly, does a monthly historical recipe for BBC History magazine. So if you haven't seen those before, I very much recommend that you try some of those out for a bit of fun, perhaps afterwards, if you're peckish after watching this over lunch. So today, Eleanor is going to talk to us about the incredibly rich history of food preservation and food waste in Britain from the 16th century to the present day, which is the focus of her fantastic book, which I have a physical copy here of to show you that it exists. So Eleanor, I will hand over to you, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And yes, do try out some of those historical recipes. Some of them not so good. Some of them are good. Right. So yes, I'm here today to talk about my book. So it's about history of food waste and of preservation. Why food waste? The impetus for this research came during the coronavirus pandemic. In the Western world, we are used to heaving supermarket shelves with rows and rows of brightly packaged branded products. But when COVID struck, this illusion of endless bounty was quickly shattered. Some food items, you'll remember, went out of stock here in the UK. Supermarkets had to place limits on certain items, certain staples that we could buy. And these images of empty supermarket shelves went viral. But at the same time, you'll remember the news was also full of pictures of food waste. So things like, this is an example from the US, but there were plenty from the UK too, litres and litres of fresh milk being thrown down the slurry pits as the demand from restaurants plummeted, as supply chains faltered, leaving no or fewer lorry drivers to go and collect the milk. And in the UK, we also had the infamous pig cull, which meant that 100,000 pigs were simply incinerated in the absence of abattoir workers to process their meat. So before this, I had a kind of general understanding that we all waste too much food. But when the food system was kind of visibly faltering, food waste suddenly seemed much more jarring. So that meant I went and did some research on the issue, finding all these crazy stats on food waste today. So, for example, a third of the food that is produced globally today simply goes to waste. And if all this wasted food in the world were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the US. And I found that the UN now really has very little time to reach its target of halving food waste by 2030. That target was set in 2015. So as a historian, I turn to the past to understand this problem, asking, how and when did we become such a wasteful society? How did our ancestors extend the life of food through preservation, the culinary reuse of their leftovers, and the recycling of their food scraps? And what can we learn, if anything, about building a sustainable future by looking to the past? So in this talk, I'm going to whiz through some of my findings in, as you've mentioned, what is quite a long history in the book that covers the medieval era right up to the present day and beyond. So I'm going to start in the early modern era. So in 1660, Chef Robert May instructed his readers to form stiff pastry into the likeness of a stag that had been shot with an arrow, then to fill that pastry carcass with red wine to mimic its blood. Another dish at the feast was a cardboard and pastry battleship with model cannons that actually fired real gunpowder, and another still was a castle with a moving drawbridge. May imagined that ladies at this feast would pluck the arrow out of the pastry stag, that the wine would then spill and drench the damask tablecloths, and delightful chaos, he said, would ensue. The ladies would throw eggs at each other, only to find that they'd been emptied of their natural contents and filled with rose water. And then there'd be this amazing mock battle between the pastry battleship and the castle, which was filled with live birds and frogs that were hidden in these gilded pies, and they'd jump out, and he says the ladies would skip and shriek in delight. Now, I've lingered on this image because I think this is the type of Tudor and Jacobean feasting that May sought to recreate, but that also kind of continues to define our image of the era. These kind of eccentric, wasteful feasts kind of resided over by the rather portly Henry VIII. However, at the same time, years of poor harvests, especially in the 1590s, meant that more and more people were falling into poverty and hunger. So in just a few years, the price of flour had nearly tripled, and in turn that, of course, affected the cost of bread, which was, of course, the most vital daily staple for everybody in the kingdom. This led to riots, so notably the Oxfordshire Rising in 1596, when led by four poor men who met on Enslow Hill, with gathering a kind of a crowd who sought to march on London and incite a rebellion. And it wasn't just the poor who had to make do in these hard times. So that same year, Sir Hugh Platt, who's a wonderfully eccentric cookbook and all sorts of other things writer, he published this recipe book, which is full of recipes sought to educate the middle and upper classes on how to cook and eat more frugally. So things like making cakes out of sweet root vegetables in the absence of sugar. So sort of a very early kind of carrot cake, if you will, or using up stale bread in a hodgepodge, so a kind of anything goes soup or broth. And from at least the 17th century, we've been reminded that willful waste makes woeful want. This is a precursor to the now familiar waste not, want not, which is a proverb that became very commonly found on tableware like this one in the Victorian era onwards. So almost everyone in Tudor England recognised that wasting food was foolish when its supplies were so delicate, lost to poor harvests and changing socio-economic conditions. What's more, in the era of the Reformation, when England was transitioning from a Catholic to a Protestant country, religious fervour was heightened, so food was understood as this ultimate gift from God, and to waste food was a sin. So there are a few ways that people were taught about this at the time. Still familiar to many of us today is the feeding of the 5,000. So in the story from the Bible, Jesus goes to mourn the passing of John the Baptist. This large crowd follow him, and then he's miraculously able to feed them on 5 loaves and 2 fish. And now, according to the Gospels, at the end of the meal, Christ told his disciples to gather the pieces that are left over. He says, so that nothing be wasted. And in the end, they supposedly collect 12 full baskets full of leftover food. Another biblical parable, this is the rich man and the poor man. So Dives goes to hell when he denied the poor man Lazarus the scraps from his table, and the poor man goes to heaven. And I love including this image. You can find it here in this is a trencher from the Elizabethan era. So the idea was it's kind of plain on the other side, made of wood, plain on the other side, and the wealthy would be having these delicious sweet treats at the end of their big feasts. And the idea was they'd turn it over and then be reminded not to eat excessively, not to waste food, and to think of the poor when they have such abundance of food. Now, even in the absence of famine, everyone, rich or poor, in early modern England was aware of the seasonal booms and busts of the earth's provisions. Everyone would spend time in some way preserving their harvest to make sure that they didn't go to waste and to ensure that they had food supplies over the long winter months. So starting in early summer with the gooseberry harvest, Tudor gentry women made precious fruits into jams and other sugary preserves to ensure that they could show off with these sweet treats on their lovely banqueting trenches throughout the winter. So marmalade actually comes from the Portuguese word marmelo, meaning quince. So in England, this is because this was an autumnal fruit that was most often made into marmalade, but commonly boiled beyond the boiling point for a longer period of time than we would today, and it became this kind of stiffer, thickened mixture that was sliced into squares or stamped even, like in this example of this beautiful stag. And then these were often given as New Year's Day presents to family, friends, and neighbours. So that's really the posh thing to be preserving. Most Tudor households throughout the kind of the social hierarchy would have kept a pig. And when the time came to slaughter it, this was a kind of exciting ritual event for the whole community, really. All of the animal would have been put to use. So pigs' innards were fried and eaten straight away. Meat was preserved with salt into hams and bacons, and then you had more heavily brined salt pork to keep for later consumption. You had pickles made out of the head, for example. The blood was collected, as you can see in this image here. Oh, you can't see in this one, sorry, but you can see the bucket, the pot next to the carcass would have been where the blood had been dripping into to collect. Bones were saved in a brine to add flavour to sauces, and then the rendered fat would make a luxurious cooking medium. So in this image, which is one of many 17th century Dutch still lifes, you can see children in the foreground are even making use of the bladder, blowing it up to use as a kind of balloon or a football. It could also be dried to kind of more sensibly, I suppose, to use as a food storage container. And you can see the mother in the background is making sausages, hanging them up there in the background. Meat was also preserved in pies. So the outer casing, which was then known as the coffin, was the kind of Tudor version of Tupperware, and it was intended only to protect the contents within rather than being eaten. And you can see here the contents being eaten with hands or with spoons. Oftentimes it was sort of like almost like a pate of meat, and then it would have some clarified butter on the top to act as a kind of seal, and then encased it in the pie casing. Right, so what would you do though if you had leftovers, if you were lucky enough to have any in Tudor England? So like Lazarus, the Tudor poor waited at the gates of grand estates to receive leftovers from lavish feasts. So we have, for example, an ordinance from Henry VIII's court of 1526, which required that all food and ale scraps be distributed to the poor, collected in 2 buckets, so one for wet, one for dry, one for solids, one for liquids, maybe that's a better way of saying it. And this was taken really seriously. So anyone in the court who didn't oblige would be expelled from the court on the 3rd account. Leftovers from large Tudor households also went to employees. So in Queen Elizabeth I's household, we have records that show people who worked cooking meats in what was called the boiling house would receive the dripping of the roast, which is literally the dripping from the roast. Even the grease, they say, in the kettles and pans as actually part of their payment for their labour. These were, of course, waste products for those with plenty, but these meat juices could be reimagined to add flavour and nutrition to sauces and gravies and so on for those with less. And these large households functioned as almost businesses which had endless departments, endless waste products seemingly, and endless ways of reusing them. So things like the lees from wine could be used by the people who worked in the royal cellars to add flavour to more flavour to leftover wine. It could be used to feed compost, or in a variety of medical remedies, things like being mixed with wheat and sheep suet with a handful of watercress to allay any swelling that you might have. And even those from humbler backgrounds were kind of encouraged to donate their surplus. So instead of throwing it to their pigs, the leftover whey, for example, from cheese making, could become a drink called wig, which was sort of fermented until it was soured and then flavoured with herbs. And the cookbook author Gervase Markham encouraged housewives to distribute a similar drink made of buttermilk, so this time the leftover liquid from the butter making process, to their poor neighbours, saying that they would, quote, find profit thereof in a defined place for their charity. So food was precious in the pre-industrial era because in the absence of artificial refrigeration, quickly wasted away. It was laboriously grown and preserved. It was oftentimes in short supply, and because it was seen as this gift from God. Far more so than today, ordinary people in the pre-modern age saved food routinely by eating up the whole of an animal once it was slaughtered, finding a use for any inedible bits, and preserving meat, fruit, and vegetables at home. Now, in our search for the beginning of the modern throwaway society, I'm now going to jump to the Victorian era and to Mrs. Beeton, with whom many of you, I'm sure, are still familiar because of her famous book of household management, which was published in 1861 and which is still found in many households today. It was published then at a time when, for the first time in history, more people were living in urban environments than in the countryside. Fueled by the Industrial Revolution and the wealth pilfered from the British Empire, London at the time was bustling, smoke-filled capital whose population had doubled between 1800 and 1850, making it the biggest city in the world. And Beeton's book, which is this kind of part cookbook, part domestic guidebook, became essential reading, really, for the new generation of urban and suburban housewives who were now separated from those traditional food production and preservation methods that we've mentioned before. And now, for the first time, food was really no longer exclusively regional. So, for example, with the advent of the railways, it was no longer profitable to peddle eggs from neighbouring countryside around London, but instead they were brought all the way from France and Belgium en masse. Now, artificial refrigeration was also changing Britain's relationship to food. So in the first edition of Mrs. Beeton's book, we find one reference to a refrigerator, which she said could be used to keep freshly pickled fruit fresh until you were ready to turn it into a preserve. In the 1907 version, however, this number had multiplied to 10. These weren't, of course, yet electronic refrigerators, but rather these kind of ice boxes, as in the picture on the right, which had been imported from America from the 1840s. In straw-lined ships had brought over the ice, that could be put into these ice boxes, which are a kind of wooden cabinet, I suppose, which had zinc-lined walls, insulated with things like asbestos, felt or slag wool, and they had this sort of separate section where you could top it up with ice, and then below a dripping tray that was regularly emptied as the ice melted. And soon, new exciting foods were being transported across the world, out of season. So after discovering the delights of the banana in the Canary Islands, London-based grocer Edward Fyfe, whose name you probably recognise from your bananas today, he began importing Cavendish bananas into Britain in the 1880s, but his business really accelerated after the introduction of refrigerated ships for his company in 1901, meaning that, of course, he no longer had to fear waste in the same way. Meanwhile, by the 1930s, oranges grown in Cape Town in South Africa were successfully being moved in fully refrigerated ships from pre-cooling facilities that could hold 6,000 tons all the way to the port of Southampton. So we're starting to see here the start of the global cold chain, which today brings us food at all times of year from across the world, preserved in this chain of refrigerators. In some ways, this system prevents wastage. So as we've mentioned in the case of New Zealand's excess lamb, but this technology also began to distance ordinary people from the production of food, leading, as we shall see, to more wasteful behaviours. So what's more, homemade pickles and preserves that used up leftovers and surplus was slowly being replaced in the Victorian era with ready-made mass-produced versions that can now be bought off the shelf at the grocers. So although Mrs. Beeton looked back wistfully on the wholesome traditional preservation techniques of the country housewife, even in that original version of her book in 1861, she was still reaching for these packaged shortcuts of the industrial age, noting that pickles could be purchased even for a cheaper price than the supposedly superior homemade versions. And a similar thing was happening to ketchup, by way of example. So housewives from the 17th century had created actually mushroom or fishy ketchups, or as they were known, catsups, based on those that had been discovered by Britons in Southeast Asia. But by the mid-19th century, tomato versions were becoming more popular. And in 1876, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, an American company launched Heinz tomato ketchup, which meant that the bottled version became available to the British housewife in 1886. And I should say, this is an example of a historical recipe that you should try. On the right, this is my mushroom, I think it's 17th century version of a mushroom catsup, which is very delicious, completely different from tomato ketchup, but very much worth making if you can at home. Then by 1888, a thick meat extract made from Argentine beef had been introduced into British homes in its soon-to-be iconic red label jar. So Bovril was the creation of John Lawson Johnson, a Scottish entrepreneur working in Canada who supplied the French army with 1 million cans of Johnson's fluid beef during the 1870s as this new way of preserving and transporting meat. And in the Victorian household, Bovril became this quick flavouring for sauces, gravies, stews, and it kind of replaced the working classes tradition of making beef tea from meat scraps and gravy, because you could simply now add water to Bovril and you get instant beef tea. Now, the Victorians have left behind mountains of disposable glass bottles and tin cans marked with the logos of these emergent brands. With the industrialization and the globalization of the food system came new waste streams. Food and the packaging that it came in was beginning to be a commodity that once bought and consumed was thrown away, rather than cyclically grown, preserved, consumed, and then the leftovers recycled at home. Now I'm jumping again. I'm jumping ahead in history to 1939 and to World War II. So before the war, Britain's food system had continued to globalize. 70% of its food was now imported from overseas, and ordinary people were becoming more and more distant from the production of their food and had therefore become more wasteful. However, when World War II hit, international trade, of course, ground to a halt, and food waste suddenly became an issue of survival on a national level. The Ministry of Food in Britain responded by commissioning a series of posters with these kind of snappy maxims. You can see one here: better luck with Churchill today than humble pie with Hitler tomorrow. Don't waste food, says this one here. And by 1940, it was a criminal offence to willfully waste food or drink that could be consumed by people. Those on the home front were implored to make do with their allocated food rations, substituting ingredients with what was available, and also by growing their own vegetables as much as possible. This is Dr. Carrot. He skips across many Ministry of Food leaflet to encourage carrot eating, sharing recipes for things like carrot cakes, given that sugar shortages of the war. And this really wasn't too far away from the vegetable-based cakes that were recommended right back in Tudor England by Sir Hugh Platt, who we met at the beginning of this talk. Potatoes too were a saving grace during wartime, and the Ministry of Food employed another anthropomorphic food character, this time Potato Pete, to encourage housewives to make the best use of potatoes and not to waste any food scraps. Any leftovers will always be put to use, so crumbs or stale crusts were reimagined in a rather luxurious crumb fudge, for example. This is another one that I would very much recommend. It's kind of like a chocolate, what they called Rice Krispie cakes, sort of a chocolate version of that, but that makes use of your old bread. Kitchen leftovers that couldn't be eaten were also really highly sought after. So things like discarded bones, which are rich in phosphorus and therefore needed for soil health, were actually a vital weapon of war, according to one World War II poster. And residents were encouraged to hand over bones to a special bone collector or to the dustman so that they could be processed into things like fertilizer or soap. Discarded fat also went to make fertilizer and even glue for aeroplane manufacture. Here's another World War II campaign. We've got a winking pig who waves one of his trotters at you, rests the other on a bin labelled pig food. "We want your kitchen waste," he says. In London, discarded scraps were known as Wembley pudding or Tottenham pudding on account of the factories where the waste was converted into pig feed once it was collected, and it emitted smells apparently from miles around. And the task of collecting these pig feed bins was taken over by in the most part, by the Women's Voluntary Service, as you can see here in this photo from 1943. In 1941, the Ministry of Food published this morale-boosting poem, which I'll very quickly read because I know I'm talking too much. "Because of the pail, the scraps were saved. Because of the scraps, the pigs were saved. Because of the pigs, the rations were saved. Because of the rations, the ships were saved. Because of the ships, the island was saved. And because of the island, the empire was saved. And all because of the housewife's pail." And indeed, by 1943, 31,000 tonnes of food waste was being saved every week, which was enough to sustain 210,000 pigs. So during the war, the government mobilized then this comprehensive campaign to teach people about how to reduce their food waste and to make use of all of their scraps. It was hugely successful in altering public habits, and in turn, food waste warriors, especially the women who were left on the home front, really did help to win the war. Now, finally, we've arrived at the post-war era. At first, as you might expect, the thrifty food habits of wartime continued. Rationing, of course, didn't end until 1953 in Britain. So, for example, Anne from Chippenham, who was born in 1945, and her sister Sue spoke to me as part of the research for my book. They told me they grew up, like most of the time, without a fridge, an American invention, which only took its place in the majority of British households in the 1970s. She said instead they had a stone slab on the floor in the larder, a meat safe, which was a small wooden or metal cupboard with mesh sides that allowed air to circulate while keeping out the insects. And said nothing was ever wasted of that time. They said things like bottles of milk would be kept in a shaded cold bucket of water in warmer months, or lined up on the windowsill in cool weather, a stone on top to prevent birds from pecking through the tin foil and getting to the cream. Their mother shopped practically every day, so at individual shops like the grocer, the butcher, the baker, etc. And leftovers were quickly used up in the kitchen to prevent them from going off. So leftover milk would become batter, potato peelings went to their chickens that they kept in the backyard. "Ice lollies, gosh, we thought we were rich," Anne told me, remembering what it was like to have a fridge freezer for the first time as an adult. It's no exaggeration to say that the introduction of artificial refrigeration changed the lives of ordinary people, and especially women who were born in the post-war era. A then youthful Mary Berry said to the housewife in her popular freezer cookery book of 1972 that you are released from the frenzy of work that ties you to the kitchen with these modern freezers and fridges. Now, the introduction of these new gadgets, along with things like television and cars, was emblematic of the rise of consumer wealth in Britain as the economy recovered after the war. Ordinary people had access to more food than ever before, and between 1961 and 92, it got cheaper, falling by almost 50% in price. And as well as following America's lead in embracing the fridge, the UK soon adopted another American invention, which is the supermarket. The first supermarket, I mean, it's always contested who's the first at everything in food history, but I think most people agree was King Cullen, which opened in Queens in New York in 1930, using the rather telling slogan, "Pile it high, sell it low." In the UK, it was a premier supermarket that was established first in London in 1951. And then we have Iceland, which of course sells exclusively frozen food in 1970 in Oswestry, Shropshire. American fast food chains also took root in this era. And together this equated to a revolution in food. So food and food waste habits as a result. So much as was the case with Victorian advances in refrigeration, although fridges and freezers could reduce waste by preserving food, they also changed consumer behavior, which meant that food waste could increase. So people, as we do now, could stock up on food that they might end up not using before it went off. You know, who among us hasn't pulled out a moldy tomato or two from the back of the fridge, or forgotten a ready meal in the freezer, you know, years past its use by date. Supermarkets meant shopping more in bulk, leaving more food to go to waste, and eating out as well became possible for the first time, with all the waste that not cooking for yourself entails. All this meant that food waste doubled in Britain between 1939 and 1976. So then by the 1970s, food waste was an integral part of the modern, hyper-productive, globalized, industrialized food system. As we moved further and further away from the homegrown food and preservation of our rural ancestors, reliant instead on mass-produced products shipped across the globe, food waste, of course, became easier in the West. Activists of the so-called new environmentalist movement were starting to see it as the incredibly significant environmental issue that it is today. And I'll just, if I can, read this part of a poem by Robert Waller, who was one of these so-called new environmentalists writing in The Ecologist in 1970. He said, "Food can be kept for the day of the resurrection, to greet the saints with the savour of baked beans. But where, by then, will the tins have all been stacked? Mountains of tins festooned with putrefied labels, mighty plateau moulded from kitchen waste, shoals of tins floating in the seas, pesticide cans of indestructible poisons, killing the fish and drifting back to the rivers." So I think it really makes that point about how food waste had become seen as this environmental issue. So then we've seen how in times of crisis, like the poor harvests of the 1590s, the world wars, but also, of course, the coronavirus pandemic in our lifetime, have sporadically reminded us of the true value of food when it suddenly becomes unavailable to us. We are now, of course, facing an impending climate disaster. Should we and our governments mobilise to prevent food waste, much as wartime leaders did? And food waste is not just, of course, an environmental concern. It is also, as we've seen, a moral issue that reflects the divide between the rich and the poor. So like the poor who waited hungrily at Tudor gates for the scraps from great feasts, today £500 at least, I think that's quite a low kind of average, is wasted needlessly on perfectly edible food each year in the UK on average. While in 2022, 14% of UK adults were in food insecurity. And of course, if we look at it on a global scale, wasted food could go into the mouths of the 842 million people globally who are living with hunger. Zooming in, I think the history of food waste offers many helpful tips and recipes. So let's bring back things like home preserves, so vegetable pickles or Victorian mango chutney, which was adapted from Indian recipes in the British Raj, a way actually of using up surplus apples rather than mango using vinegar. World War II crumb fudge, I've already mentioned, is a great recipe for using up leftover bread. We could transform milk on the turn into cottage cheese or educate the public on how to compost at home. And another issue is bringing back food waste as pig feed. But more broadly, this history teaches us, I think, about the importance of connecting with our food again. Today, our meat is presented to us in these uniform cuts. It's in plastic packaging from the supermarket shelves. But for those Tudor cottagers or those who lived in cramped Victorian tenement blocks and reared their own pigs, looking it in the eye at slaughter time, they would not have dreamed of wasting any of this precious resource, this precious animal. There are today many wonderful local initiatives that hope to teach us how to harvest our own crops. This is just an example. The Children's Kitchen, who are based just down the road from me in Bristol, and who get nursery-aged children from disadvantaged backgrounds to grow and cook vegetables. You know, if you've ever grown your own carrots, you know how hard it is to protect them from being eaten from pesky slugs. And you know the pride when you finally get to eat something that you've actually grown, even if, you know, like my carrots were about this big. So ultimately then, if as a society we learn to love food, not just the quick pleasures of taste and smell that we gain from eating it, but actually also the processes of growing, nurturing, pruning, weeding, cooking, preserving and composting, perhaps then we will waste less of it. If we rediscover the histories behind what we're eating and the value that that food had to those who have come before us, who, you know, laboriously moved it from farm to fork in the absence of modern technologies, perhaps then we will all waste less. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Anna. And I can already see some questions appearing in the chat, which I will now begin to work through. But if you've got a question for Eleanor, they'll please do feel free to put it to us via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So the first one I've got here is actually about, I guess, partly about the role of the state in all of this, which is a question about, have you had a look at all at the role of the history of subsidies for food production in potentially affecting food waste? I guess partly being implied here is maybe causing more food waste, but the example given was subsidies to sugar production in the US from the 1970s onwards. But yeah, what role subsidies in all of this and the subsidization of food production?
Oh, that's a big question. So state subsidies. I mean, a huge issue is since we've come out of the EU, is what to do with the money that used to be granted to farmers based on the to grow their food based on the amount of land that they had. And one of the proposals was, instead of giving money based on how much land you have, because it led to problems like, I think the now king had actually received the biggest subsidy from the UK government. Rather, we should be giving it to farmers who are the least wasteful or are the most sustainable. So I think that's a huge question now moving forward with the new government as well, and somewhere that we could make a huge difference. Actually, perhaps a positive that could come from leaving the way that the EU subsidies works. I'm just trying to think more historically. I don't think I could think of an example off the top of my head.
That's fine. We can move
Yeah,
on to the next one and
but
come back to it.
I'm going to think a little bit more about that more historically, because that's really interesting.
I mean, this is one of the great things about these talks, right? People will always come up with new ideas for new angles on what you're already doing.
Yes.
A second question here from the chat, which is why this is sort of because obviously the book is to a certain extent focused on Britain
Yes,
and
it
its
is. Yeah.
own history of kind of food waste and preservation. And so there's a question here about why Eastern Europe today seems to have a very strong tradition of preserving and curing
Mm.
different food stuffs that doesn't appear to have, to the mind of the questioner at least, doesn't appear to have a kind of equivalent in a UK context. You know, is it the case that Britain have just kind of done away with lots of those traditions of curing and preserving foods in ways that other countries haven't?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it kind of reminds me of just the general question that I get a lot is kind of why don't British people have a food culture? um, I think that's sort of tied into it. We are and have been historically the most wasteful and the most dependent in Europe, sorry, and the most dependent on sort of packaged processed foods. Um, it's really hard to kind of uh, sort of pinpoint one specific reason for that. Some people might like to go back to the old Puritans and say that it's something that sort of changed in our food culture even that long ago. I wouldn't agree with that. But I wonder if it is something to do with just the Victorian era, the building of what was seen as kind of a modern empire, and that being reliant on kind of processed uh, globalized food was seen as more modern and therefore more attractive in a way that wouldn't have been the case in other uh, countries that didn't obviously have such a huge kind of industrial revolution. Um, so yeah, I wonder if it's that, but I mean, I also think it's worth saying, there is still, we do have a British food culture, of course, and there are plenty of people who are kind of rediscovering and reconnecting with a lot of traditional preserves. I think it's worth saying, a lot of people, um, more often who live in the countryside, will still be making lovely jams and things like that. And there are also some sort of lesser known traditional ways of preserving food, like suins, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, um, in Scotland, which is I made a while ago, which is fermented oats, which is a wonderful process because you get a drink and then you get different levels of ferment and liquids and solids and so on. So there are traditions in Britain. Um, we do have a food culture, and a lovely one that people are discovering. And then, sorry, long answer, but I think finally, there's also a question about wealth and how it seems to be actually a kind of privileged thing to be able to make your own preserves, and pickles and things like that, or ferments. It's seen as sort of at least a middle class kind of movement, and that's of something to do with how it's actually very expensive here to get fresh ingredients, and it's actually cheaper to get processed packaged products. So that, of course, is a huge problem, and there isn't an easy solution as to how to kind of get back our history of preserving at home.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to mute myself while my doorbell goes off. The perils of presenting from home. There's an interesting point in the chat about whether this is also in an Eastern European context to do with communism, and I think that actually speaks to some of what you were
Oh
saying,
wow.
Eleanor, about the way a lot of these kind of techniques and ways of dealing with food waste are the product of crisis, aren't they? They're
Mm.
about kind of trying to deal with adverse situations. I wanted to ask a fun question though next, which
Mhm.
is partly because I'm intrigued by the answer, which is what meal in history would you have wanted to be at the table for? So it's a more kind of general
Oh,
food history question, but a fascinating one, I think, for us all to think about.
ooh. Well, I'm not sure I can think of exactly one, but what I am researching at the moment is looking at these more sort of mundane or daily meals that people of different faiths and different religion, different races had in the early modern era. So I've been recently in the Venetian archives, and you can look at these Inquisition records, and you find things like a someone who was captured by the Turks, and who converted to Islam and then was sort of snuck back into they had like a sort of a fondico, like a kind of almost like a ghetto for Muslim people in then Catholic Venice, and snuck in to share food with the Muslims there. So those types of things I find fascinating, kind of actually less about the kind of big meals of history, I suppose, and more about these like undercover connections that ordinary people were making, oftentimes sort of breaking the law then, breaking kind of norms, and actually sort of living actually quite sort of multicultural, diverse lives in a way that we wouldn't expect.
That's super, super interesting. Thanks,
Mm.
Anna. There's another question here about I don't know if I'd want to experience one of these meals or not. But someone's suggesting that in France in the 19th and 20th century there were marchands de harlequins who collected leftover food from restaurants, hotels, and aristocratic residences, recreated them as plated meals, and then sold these ready-made meals in the markets. And they were wondering if
Ah,
anything similar was going on in the UK at any point in our past. Which sounds fascinating.
when did you say that was? Sorry.
The 19th and early 20th centuries in France, apparently.
Oh, interesting. Um, I can't think of like an exact equivalent, but it does remind me of the Victorian. Um, they had like an incredibly, actually quite a kind of tight system of poorer people going round and down around the back doors of nicer houses, and collecting kitchen scraps and then selling them on to poorer people. So it kind of reminds me of that. I loved for the book researching those people who just any type of food that was kind of like that collector, like a someone who collected um, old hairs, so they could then go and be made into top hats for rich people. Uh, but all in these kind of back alley kind of deal ways, or people who collected the drippings from expensive roasts that were happening in these posh houses, and then sold it as just like a spread on a piece of bread to poor people. So that kind of thing. And like I said, there's endless varieties of kind of food waste collectors, and I love how yeah they were so resourceful, and how you kind of uncover this sort of network of connections between the rich and poor, and it has to be sort of out of sight because the posh people don't want to know what's happening to their leftovers.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a couple of questions, sort of for sort of final questions, I suppose. There's been a couple of questions about whether we should be engaging people more in schools with the
Hmm.
question of food waste. And in particular, one audience member asked about kind of what used to be called home economics,
Oh
and
yes.
whether this is something that actually we ought to be teaching people more in schools and kind of be reintroduced actually as a way to get people to think about waste more. I mean, certainly in your presentation there was a suggestion that this is something that's happening. But do you think there's more that we can do?
Oh, definitely. So um the types of initiatives that I have, the one I mentioned, the Children's Kitchen, and there are plenty of others, have actually all tended to be have been born in the coronavirus pandemic, by charities, or just by concerned citizens who, at the time, it was so stark how many people were struggling to have enough food. So and unfortunately, I would say most of those initiatives that I know about have since had to close up shop because they haven't got funding, they haven't got support. Um, so I think there's a massive gap for it to be. top-down governmental initiatives, and to put that as part of the curriculum, because yeah, my understanding is that it's not something that is prioritized at all, even teaching children about food, how to cook. It is unfortunately seen as a kind of like a kind of second tier, or even like a kind of easy subject, I think, when of course it's not. It opens up the whole world to understand where your food comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also kind of is suggestive of the way in which actually a lot of this concern over food waste is at the intersection of so many other things, right? So whether
Mm,
that's education or poverty and inequality, I mean, as your
yes,
book really
exactly. Yeah,
richly shows, it's kind of at the root of all of these other big issues in our current society, whether that's, climate, I suppose, is another one as well.
yeah.
Um, Brilliant. So I think that's pretty much all we've got time for.
Hmm.
So I'm going to sort of thank you, Eleanor, for a fascinating talk, and some really excellent and intriguing answers to some great questions from the audience. So thank you as
Yes,
well
thank
to the
you. Yeah.
audience for attending and for getting involved and for answering some thought-provoking things in the chat. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Eleanor's fantastic book, which I will show again to everybody, and look, there's multiple copies. Lovely, lovely book. Then, and just a reminder of the title, it's Leftovers: A History of Food Waste and Preservation. Look at that, lovely color images. That's the kind of quality that you want from your paperback publication. There are copies available from the partner bookseller for the festival, Fox Lane Books, at foxlanebooks.co.uk if you'd like to order online. Yeah, and that's all from us, I think. I think we're pretty much done. So thank you again to all of you for attending. Thank you to Eleanor, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. And whatever you do for lunch, if you've got any leftovers, don't throw them away.